Rafael Toral, welcome to the Samuel Andreyev podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Likewise. So I thought what we could do with this conversation is a couple of things. The first is we could introduce you and your work to my listeners, for those who might not be familiar with what you're doing. And the second is, for me, I'm extremely curious about your process, about how you work. And that's something that I always like to ask musicians about. And sometimes composers can be a little bit secretive about that, but we'll see what happens. So the first thing is a confession, which is that I hadn't heard of you at all until a few months ago, when in the lead up to Spectral Evolution being released. And that was the first work of yours that I'd heard. And when I first heard the recording, I just about fell out of my chair. I thought this is absolutely incredible. Everybody should hear this. And I heard about it through Jim O'Rourke, who has been on my show a couple of times. And so when the album came out, I got a notice on Twitter about the fact that it had been released. So I thought, okay, well, I'll definitely order that. And I waited maybe 3 days, something like that, to click the order button. And by that time, it had already sold out, which also really struck me. So I was able, through your help and kindness, to get a copy of the LP, which is called Spectral Evolution. And this, I can only say to anybody who isn't familiar with your work yet, this is an outstanding album in every respect. And when I was talking with Jim, one of the things he told me was that, it's obvious listening to it that it was done in a very careful and perfectionistic way. It's an unbelievably clean, well-engineered recording. It's very tightly organized as well as a composition. So it's obvious that there's a lot of effort put into it, but I think I couldn't have grasped quite how much work went into this without talking to Jim. He said that there were countless iterations of the mix, something like 50 or 60 versions that you were sending to him throughout the process. So perhaps we could start there. Can you tell me a little bit about where this album comes from, how it fits into your body of work more generally also? Because I've listened to quite a lot of your music since I first heard this album, and it strikes me as somewhat of a new development in terms of your work. So could you start by laying out what the project of the album was and what brought you to that point?
Well, it is and it isn't. For me, it's like a bit of, it sums up most of what I've done so far in these last 30 years, because it has direct references and recovers audio, not audio material, but sound from the earlier recordings, my earlier records, and also from a second period where I was working with electronic instruments in a more post-free jazz-inspired kind of way, in terms of articulation and phrasing. I was playing electronic music, but mostly inspired by jazz. And before that, I used to do ambient, drone-ish guitar music. So when I started working with these electronic instruments, I really wanted to do something completely different, in a way that there was a cut with the previous body of work, which we're talking about like the first 15 years of work and then the following 15 years. So one of the main ideas for Spectral Evolution was to bring these two bodies of work together, because they were meant to be completely separate and even required different models of thought about music to carry on with each project. So they were incompatible by nature, and mostly because the electronic instruments are custom built and they have an experimental nature, and they can't really play in tune. They're like feedback devices or circuit bent electronic circuits that make sound, but you can't play a melody with them. And I've managed to record bits of phrasing that sounded in the key of the chords that I was working with on the guitars. So yeah, the one of the core ideas was to have this experimental approach to electronic music, listening, understanding harmony, and marrying these two together, like forcing them to understand each other and talk to each other, once they were meant to be separate models of thought and work. And that in itself seemed like an appropriate thing to do, because there was it means something about reconciliation and the understanding of opposite positions, which is something that is needed in the world today.
Mm. How would you define experimental music? What does that term mean for you?
Yeah, I don't have an easy time with that word. I was just using it for the sake of simplicity. When in doubt, I always use John Cage's definition. Experimental action is the one which outcome cannot be foreseen.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is an attitude. It's a posture with regards to production and performance of music material. It never means a genre or a style, and I think it offers itself to these misconceptions about experimental music being a kind of music, and I can't look at it that way. But I mentioned the word with respect to the instruments. Once they are, I can control them as instruments, but they won't let themselves be 100% controlled. So there's always a margin of error. So I can have a very sharp and focused idea about some, I'll perform a sound and have an idea of what kind of sound I want. And I cannot be 100% sure that it's going to be that sound. It can be approximate. So it's a constant feedback of listening to what the instrument is doing and adapting the performance gesture to whatever is happening within the instrument. So it's always listening and making decisions. So that has an experimental nature, because I don't really know what is going to happen exactly with what the instrument is doing.
I'd like to just briefly jump in here and say that this channel exists because of the support that I receive on Patreon. If you are a regular listener and would like to see more of what I do, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/Samuel Andreyev. You'll find the link in the video or podcast description. You'll get exclusive previews, the ability to submit questions, CDs, signed prints, and more. But you can also support my work by subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, or joining in on the discussion through the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and let's get back to the interview. Okay, so that interests me quite a lot for a few reasons. So one of them is that this idea of instruments that can only be partially controlled and accepting that there's a degree of the accidental in the process, that's something that I associate actually quite a lot with pop and rock music in particular, given the sorts of innovations that you see with sound in pop music. And I suppose there's a commercial reason for why those sorts of artists need to innovate, need to come up with an exciting sound. But you see things like sticking a knitting needle in the cone of a speaker to develop a fuzz sound, and those are experimental actions in a sense. And when you do things like that, you relinquish a certain amount of control, which is something that you would probably not spontaneously associate with composed music as such. So what you're describing, to me, it makes me think of a couple of movements that I became familiar with during my student years, which of course...
Can I respond to that?
Please, yes.
I wouldn't say... I wouldn't look at it that way, because pop music is mostly made with instruments that were designed and built to be controlled in terms of, like with the guitar you play chords because it was built for that, or with the bass you can play bass lines and so on. And with all the instruments that are used to make musical instruments. And those kind of experiments it's not like experimental in the sense that something is going to happen. It's a technique that you can evaluate. Like if you put a needle in the cone and you like the sound, like the fuzz sound, then you use it. You can make decisions about it. Or like recording a bass drum with a speaker. That kind of stuff. It's just experimentation, but it's the difference between experimental and experimenting, which is when you have an intention to use a certain technique, you experiment, and then you decide upon the experiences you've made, and you do the stuff, and that's not experimental, because it's intentional.
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting distinction. There's a remark from Edgar Varèse, the composer, who said something along the lines that his music, well, he responded actually to an interviewer somewhat angrily to the suggestion that his music was experimental by saying, my music's not experimental. What you hear when you hear one of my pieces is a complete composition. It's a complete finished piece of work. The experiments end up in the wastebasket. So...
Yeah, I can imagine he would be quite pissed off.
But, well, okay, so that's an important distinction between experimental and experimenting. So it's not the same thing. In a sense, if you put the knitting needle in the speaker, then the sound might be the result of experimenting, but once you've decided to use it on a track, you're using it knowing what the outcome is going to be, because you've already mastered it and controlled it and turned it into something you want to use. Nevertheless, so there's something that to me this connects with, and well, the title of your album is perhaps an indicator. There's spectral music on the one hand, so the French spectral composers of the 1970s and beyond, who tended to work with sounds that were not completely controllable. In other words, sounds where there was an inherent instability and complexity to the sound that a classical performer would not be able to completely control. And then there was also a kind of secondary movement that grew out of that in the early 2000s called saturation music, which was also a French phenomenon. And the idea there was to integrate more experimental practices, very, very complex gestures played on musical instruments that inherently could not be completely controlled. So I wonder, first of all, how interested in or aware of these movements you might be, and whether the title of your album is intended as a reference to spectral music.
No, I don't follow these developments. And the title actually came from a post that a friend of mine wrote when I was touring the US a few years ago in the North Carolina, I think, and he was like telling people to come to the shows, and he used the expression spectral evolution, describing what I was doing, and I looked at it, oh, that's a nice expression. I think I'm gonna use that for the title of an album sometime in the future.
I see. Okay.
And it's vaguely about evolution, which is a notion that I care about, of evolution of music culture, at least. And spectral describes anything that happens in the audio spectrum. So it's not a very specific meaning. It's just the connection is more vague than specific. It's just that the wordplay is, and the sound of the words and is inspiring, and I thought it would be a good title.
Okay. Because one of the things that made me think of is the spectralist group of composers were interested in the physicality of sound, which I think connects with what you're describing. So in other words, and that might seem like an obvious thing actually for a lot of musicians. Of course, you'd be interested in timbre and qualities of sound and the physical dimension of sound. But for a lot of composers, it's not necessarily a predominant thing that they're thinking about, because there's a lot of composed music that's abstract, on the abstract side, and it's not necessarily explicitly about sound as such. But it certainly seems, pursuing your catalog, that that's a absolutely predominant interest of yours. So what I understand from your description is that spectral evolution is an attempt to bring together these very controlled harmonic progressions that you can play on the guitar, and then sounds and processes and instruments that can be controlled to an extent, but not completely, and to make those two things coexist. Is that right?
That's one of the core ideas. There are many threads of thinking and references and interests that it's a weird confluence of threads in music that came together on the album. So that's one. You are going to ask a question. Sorry.
Well, I'm just curious to know what your starting point was with this, because you've described the fact that this represents an evolution in your musical thinking, and that you wanted to synthesize together different things that previously in your practice had been separate. But how did you make the first step? I mean, how did you go about planning this? Because it sounds to me like a very deliberately made, very carefully planned body of work. What was the starting point?
It's a gradual process. At some point, like in the 2017 or so, I felt that this approach to electronic music that's very sharp and very has a lot of agency with making decisions and listening, just like in jazz music. At some point, I felt like the environment around suggested that an approach to music more related to stepping back and looking at the big picture and taking a deep breath and just taking it a bit slower might be appropriate. I felt inspired to lean towards this kind of approach, and as I was thinking about it, and I was observing my own movements, making records that had started having more of a static quality, it just dawned on me that I had a whole discography and history of dealing with music with an approach that has that spirit. Like from my first record in 1994, Sound Mind Sound Body, up until Moonfield, which is 2017. Oh, sorry, until Space from 2006. All these records have this kind of ambient, drone, static quality. Not too static, you have to listen. But basically guitar music with a certain stillness in it. And I thought, well, I can certainly, if I'm going to work in this direction, I can certainly regain contact with my earlier practice with the guitar and with this approach to sound and music. So that's one of the threads that is Spectral Evolution is an album that goes back and brings back, recovers my work with the guitar. I think I'm lost now. I was describing the threads. Oh, another thread is that I was growing more and more fascinated with 1930s harmony, jazz harmony, especially from listening to the arrangements on certain jazz standards. For instance, as songs recorded by Billie Holiday, she most of the time she would have really good arrangers and performers. She would often work with the musicians from the Count Basie Orchestra, and a lot of her songs have really outstandingly brilliant arrangements. And I've been a fan of Billie Holiday since I was a teenager. But in recent years, I've been listening very carefully about the orchestrations for the songs, and I found them so moving and beautiful that I was wishing to find some way to be in touch with it, to have some kind of contact with that. With that world of harmonic thinking that would make sense for me to work with, and this was an opportunity to bring back the guitar sound which I used for harmonic music in the past, and use it to embody an approach to this harmonic thinking of the classic jazz. So that's another main component of Spectral Evolution, is it's a kind of a tribute to harmonic thinking of early jazz, like harmonic thinking in the 1930s. And what I was mostly interested in was the harmonies, the chord progressions that were used at the time. And I went to look for the most common and basic and classic chord progressions as patterns, like as types, not anything specific, but standard templates, like rhythm changes, which is a very, very common progression. It's all based on a 3-6-2-5 turnaround. Or another jazz standard that became a template for other standards, like Take the A Train by Duke Ellington, and other structures which are very common as building blocks And since I wanted to highlight the harmonies, one thing that was very clear from the start is that I would have to slow them down a lot, so that each chord could exist and create a space of its own. So I stretched the swing as far as it could go, to the point where if you hear the chord progression on Spectral Evolution, you can still feel the progression. You can when there's a chord change, you still have a sense of the whole progression, where it came from and where it's going. And if it were slower than this, it would already sound like an isolated event, like a chord changes into another chord and you don't remember why. That's changed.
That's really interesting though, because it implies that it's sort of like an elastic band, and if you stretch it beyond a certain point, it just breaks and you can't follow the continuity anymore. So there's a point.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a cutoff point, right? So you discovered presumably how slow you could make these progressions without them completely falling apart.
Yeah. So the average tempo on Spectral Evolution is about 20 BPM.
Wow. Okay, that's quite slow.
That's very slow.
Yeah. Stockhausen and other experimental composers in the 50s and 60s were interested in these kinds of perceptual phenomena of determining what the limit points were for what sort of meaningful distinctions we can make in terms of sound. One of the things that Stockhausen was interested in was how small can you make an interval until it becomes impossible to distinguish from another one? How much can you slow something down before time just becomes a totally different category? You can no longer distinguish between different durations. So for example, you can distinguish between a sound that is 1 second long and one that is 2 seconds long without too much difficulty. But if you're involved in more complex ratios like 11 seconds versus 12 seconds, then it's impossible to tell the difference for anybody. And so there are what would you say? There are thresholds for all of these phenomena.
Yes, and another thing that is interesting also is that if you have like a regular pace of change, which is anyway very, very slow, and as soon as it becomes predictable, it becomes boring. And if you make it even slower, then it potentially can become interesting, or if it doesn't change at all, because when you it's like time molds your perception of whether you find something interesting or not. And if there's a chord and it changes, and it's like, okay, there's a chord change, and then another one, and okay, I got it. And if it doesn't change, then you stop expecting any change, and you realize, okay, so this is it. This is like the focus and the core of interest in this music is in the permanence of the sound and not in the change, and your attention completely shifts into the qualities of a sound that stays the same, even if it modulates. Well, I'm digressing, but yeah, that's sometimes some of the things that make a listening experience interesting or not has to do with the rate of change.
Absolutely. Well, what you're describing is harmonic rhythm, and harmonic rhythm can be completely static, or it can be very slow, or it can be very fast, right? So, and that's an important parameter to consider when you're looking at a piece of music. So I can rattle off a few examples. There's the prelude to Das Rheingold, the Wagner opera, which is a single chord held for 5 or 6 minutes, an E-flat major chord. And because there's zero harmonic motion in that piece, you quickly realize that it's not going to be about that. There's not going to be a melodic dimension. There's not going to be any sense of movement coming from the harmony. And so the interest in that piece of music is all pretty much in the orchestration and the texture, and a little bit in the rhythm, although there's not that much happening in the rhythm either. So you can have 6 minutes of one chord, and it can be completely riveting, provided that the other musical parameters are giving you something that is as interesting or more interesting. So there is also a series of pieces written by the Italian composer Giacinto Scelsi called Quattro Pezzi. And those are 4 pieces written on a single tone. And so he made this orchestral suite of pieces where he's concentrating on a single tone and its overtones and its slight variations, its slight microtonal variations over the course of several minutes. And there again, you're not expecting the harmonic rhythm to be particularly fast or to go anywhere at all. So you can focus on the plasticity of the sound. So, all right. So it sounds like that was a major preoccupation for you when you were producing this album.
Yes, I experimented. There you go, a lot with tempo to have to get the feeling of up to what point the chord progressions would still hold as progressions that made sense for the listener. I actually don't have that memory. I should hear it again. Like in my early days, I was fascinated about writing music, and I had a really strong interest in contemporary music and graphic scores and microtonal notation and so on. And at a certain point, this is like 1993, I started recording an album which is titled Wavefield. And it's a guitar album of sustained drone, sustained long sounds based on a single chord. And there you go, like the piece lasts 30 minutes and it's basically one chord. And it has lots of internal modulations and harmonics, not in terms of harmony, but of harmonics of sound, the sound spectrum, modulations and filtering and so on. And as I was working on that, I found out that I was making music inside the sound. It's not like you write a piece of music and the music is in the paper and the sound is going to manifest and materialize the music. So this was the opposite. I was just making a sound, and all the music content, whatever was interesting in the piece, was internal modulations in the sound. And then I realized, okay, I can't write it. If I write the chord in a staff, in a music sheet, it will mean nothing, because there's a lot happening that can't be written. And that's where I completely abandoned the idea of writing music.
Right. There's a point at which notation is no longer adequate. There are certain things that musical notation can do reasonably well. And for the sorts of things you're describing, for extreme subtleties of timbre and sonic evolution, it's very, very difficult. Or else you have to invent entirely new types of notation, and you have to include all kinds of instructions, text-based instructions in the score for the performer to understand what you're doing. But at that point, it seems like it's easier just to make a recording.
Yes, that reminds me of all the electronic music tradition. It has so much to do with experimenting with the physicality of sound and with the playfulness of working with the filters and oscillators and whatever. And it reminds me of some interview with Stockhausen in which he was saying, I don't know if it was about elektronische Studie, like the very early electronic pieces, that like some students recreated those pieces from his original scores. And he was saying that it was lifeless, that it had no real interest, intrinsic musical interest, even though the scores were fulfilled. And that's because the tactile nature and the listening and all the intuitiveness of making those pieces, even if you could describe them with a score, there was a lot that didn't make it into the paper. And that probably explains why a realization of the piece will sound dull and another one would sound rich.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because I'm familiar with that recording. There's a recording on YouTube. We can actually put a link to it in the video description here for anyone who wants to hear it. But the piece is Studie 1 or Studie 2. I can't remember which one it is, but it's one of the very early Stockhausen electronic pieces. And the score consists of a series of triangular shapes where he's specifying the bandwidth and the amplitude of the frequencies in the sound. And then and that's it.
I think the track, I never really studied, but there's like two lines, one with rectangles and squares, and another with triangles.
That's right.
And it seemed to me that rectangles determine spectrum areas of frequencies, and the triangles would describe amplitude.
Yes, I think that's right. That's right.
I love that score, and that like Stockhausen would have really brilliant ways of writing those scores, like the score for Microphonie 1. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great piece.
But yeah, please send me the link. I saw a bit of a video of your analysis of Gesang der Jüngerlinge, and it's really interesting.
It's a fascinating piece. Well, the thing that you mentioned about the Elektronische Studie is, it's true that when you listen to the version of it that was made, I think it was in the Netherlands or somewhere, by students, they realized his intentions to the letter. It's extremely precise, but that's the problem in a sense, is that, as you say, there's no life in the sound. It's very clinical, it's very clean, and it shows you what the structures are in the score. But if you were to make an analogy with classical music, for example, so you could take a Beethoven score, for example, and produce a MIDI version of that piece that would give you all of the durations and all of the pitches, and they would be exactly precise in accordance with the notation. But the recording would be unlistenable. It would be completely uninteresting to listen to. So there is, even with something as seemingly as dry and technical as those early electronic etudes, there's a degree of, what would you call it, interpretation, of subjectivity, of the accident also that comes into the production of works like that. And so when you listen to the original versions that Stockhausen made, which are not as clean and they're dirty and they're imprecise, but there's a grain to the sound that is much more compelling.
But I think it's more than that. It's not like, I don't know how the piece was made. These pieces were made, but I really doubt he wrote them first and went on to perform them with the score. I think a lot of electronic music from that time is more of a creative endeavor in the studio, and the score is a description of what was there, or a mix, maybe with like a cutting length of tape. Requires some prior decision about durations, and so that is consistent with writing a score. But I'm quite convinced that there was a lot of experimenting and fun being had with the oscillators and the filters and all the electronic studio, because you can hear this playfulness in the music in Contacte, for instance, as well. There's it's like you're with a synthesizer and you're just jamming, you know, and it's a lot of fun. And of course, it's not so intuitive and not so fluent if you're trying to write a piece of electronic music. You're more like self-conscious and so on. But I wouldn't be surprised if the score was a description of, you know, creative moments resulted from experimenting with the instruments. Not only this piece, but probably a lot of the 50s electronic music was probably made in this way. It doesn't really make much sense to think, okay, I'm going to tune the oscillator to this frequency and then put it through a filter and to a ring modulator and turn the knobs in this way. It has to do with the sound. So I think for a composer it will only make sense to compose electronic music through experience with the sound of the studio and the instruments. And
yes, I think
write them in the score to describe what was made.
I think that's right. I think it depends on the piece. I know that Stockhausen at the time was also writing these total serial pieces, and he was interested in combining serial approaches where you can exactly control durations and frequencies and pitches and so on, and you can make these structures and then you can realize them electronically in the studio. So I think there was some of that going on, but I'm sure also that at times he was producing the sounds in the studio and then writing down what he was doing as he did it, and then the score simply became a reflection of the process by which the piece was made. But there's a famous example, which is the Ligeti piece Articulation, which is quite an amazing electronic composition. And the score for that is there's this beautiful multicolor graphic score that was produced for that piece, but it wasn't made by Ligeti. It was made by an artist after the fact. And there's a video of that on YouTube as well, where you can see these blobs of color and shapes that seem to be responding to the events in the music. But that was not made by Ligeti at all. So there are a lot of different processes that are possible. When I was studying electronic composition in Paris, I remember we had a few classes with somebody who tried to convince us of the importance of making scores for our electronic music, and he sort of talked about the different ways you could do that. And I found it kind of pointless at the time. I didn't really understand why it would be necessary to produce a score for an electronic piece, and why would you not just listen to it? And I still kind of feel that way. I don't really. Sometimes they can be interesting anecdotally as graphic documents, and sometimes they can allow you to have some insights into how a piece is put together. But it seems to not really reflect the purpose behind those pieces in the first place.
I think it probably makes more sense if it's if the score describes broad strokes, like I don't know the score for. Is it Gruppen? Like there's a piece of a Stockhausen piece for 3 orchestras or 4 and ring modulators. So there's a score for the person with the mixer and for the person with the ring modulator.
That's Carré, which is that's
Carré. Yeah. I've been out of touch with those for a long while, and it's not. It's a different process, which is more, even probably Microphonie has this quality of not being very specific about modulations and the particulars of electronic sound production, as in the other electronic pieces. They are like more instructions for processing, and and this can be probably performed either more in a way that doesn't it's not so limiting in terms of the final sound, because it involves physical performance in acoustic instruments as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your musical background and how you became aware of these different musical fields, and what your training consisted of also, because I'm becoming, well, I've been aware for a long time, but I'm becoming more acutely aware of the fact that there are musical traditions that are totally parallel to each other that don't necessarily communicate all that much, and that I think would really benefit from being more aware of each other. You know, because there's certainly a tradition of primarily composed music, of people writing scores, and there are all kinds of traditions within that. But then there are also people who are completely outside of that paradigm, who are more coming from the angle of performers or improvisers, or who are making recordings primarily, but that are not producing scores. And I find it actually quite odd that there isn't more of a connection between those communities. There are a few people that have a foot in both worlds, but it's pretty unusual. So tell me about your own background, your musical beginnings, and what got you interested in this.
Well, I'm mostly self-taught. I learned the basics of music in early on, of basic music notation, and when I was 15 years old, I bought a guitar, and I was involved in local rock bands, and I was interested in experimenting with the sound of the guitar very early on, with electronic devices that you can plug to the guitar. And I grew more and more interested in approaches to music that were uncommon, unlike what I would hear on the radio. And I got interested first in John Cage and Brian Eno. And for quite a lengthy period, I became interested in contemporary music. There was a festival in Lisbon that had a yearly programming of contemporary music, and I saw Xenakis, Berio, and Stockhausen all came there. And there was composition seminars by Emmanuel Nunes.
Oh, Nunes, yeah. I knew him a little bit in Paris.
Yeah, he was based in Paris, I think. But he would come every year to Lisbon. There would be pieces of his performed almost every year, and he would give composition seminars that I attended to some. And I still enroll in a class of analysis and composition techniques, and that was about the time that I started recording Wavefield and realized that writing music was not something that I should pursue. So for and then I knew the work of Alvin Lucier, and that changed my life completely. The piece I Am Sitting in a Room, in which he basically converts acoustic space into music through resonance, through a build-up of resonance. Do you know this piece?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And resonance resonance and oscillation and feedback became core elements of my music.
Well, I say, of course I know it, but I should quickly point out that a lot of people are not going to know that piece. So Alvin Lucier is an experimental American composer who produced a lot of pieces that were extremely important for a lot of people, including I Am Sitting in a Room. But the first one that I heard was A Silver Streetcar for the Orchestra, which is a piece for triangle. And I've heard a few performances of that piece. And on the face of it, you might think that a composition for solo triangle that lasts 15 minutes might not be the most riveting experience. But it's amazing what he can do with the simplest of means, just by methodically exploring resonance. So no, he's a very, very, very interesting figure. So if anybody listening to this isn't familiar with Alvin Lucier, I would certainly encourage them to listen. He died, I think, a few years ago, but a major figure in American music.
Recently, yes. Yeah, in this piece, he just records his voice reading a text, and the recording plays back into a room, and there's a microphone recording the sound of his voice and the room, and then that recording is played again, and then several generations of the recording, which is a build-up of the resonance of the room plus his voice, are all spliced together, and in the end it becomes completely inarticulate. Like the resonant frequencies of the room are just a really beautiful wash of harmonics, and it's completely magic. To continue, I had basic guitarist skills, like the ones that a rock musician would have, and had very basic understanding of harmony. Like I could tell a major chord from a minor chord, not much else. And when I got to a point where I felt a sense of completion about this guitar music that I was doing, I decided to shift into something completely different and start making music based on silence, and have empty space populated with sharp sound events that were meant to be articulate with a sense of phrasing, very much inspired by the thinking of a jazz musician. Sometimes my playing with feedback was described as resembling a trumpet, and that's because I wasn't so much inspired by the history of electronic music, but more by trumpet players like Bill Dixon or Miles Davis, who would apply a sense of phrasing that had a lot of space in it, and they would integrate silence in the tension and the meaning of their own phrasing. And they were really masters at doing that. So I learned a lot about jazz history and about jazz performance, and how a jazz musician thinks, and ported it into electronic music practice. Later on, more recently, when I started having these ideas that would point towards spectral evolution, as I decided to use jazz harmonic thinking from the 1930s, as soon as I started working on them, I realized, well, I need to know a lot more about harmony than what I do. It's not just a matter of pasting these chords and that's it. I had to know how to articulate chord changes, and which I didn't at this level. yeah, I studied harmony and theory. I bought books, like friends lent me other books. Like I bought a keyboard which I had never had, and a friend lent me a book called Piano Voicings for Non-Pianists, so I could have a better understanding of voicings. And yeah, I had to, on one hand, experiment, on the other hand, study, because the one of the great difficulties that I found when I started working on the harmonies for this album was in the voicings of the chords. So I couldn't use guitar voicings because those chord inversions depend on what the left hand of a guitarist can do and what strings he can fret. So it's very limiting. And I started studying piano voicings, and those also didn't work because that depends on the shape of a hand and how many notes you can play with one single hand, which are close to each other. And this kind of arrangement is more typical of a string orchestra than a piano. So, but even that wouldn't work because I wanted to have a specific kind of sound, and I wanted to spread out the chords to open them more in a greater extension. And I also had to learn later on, because I had these chord sequences as stacks of notes, and they were all correct, but they didn't sound right. They didn't flow between themselves. And then I started studying voice leading, and I started thinking horizontally in terms of voices. So I even called the guitar voices baritone and tenor, alto, and so on. And then slowly I ended up finding ways to make chord alterations and work with progressions with a concern with voice leading. And yeah, so I had to work my way towards learning and understanding harmony enough to be able to come up with what is the result, which is the Spectral Evolution album, and I'm very happy about it. I think that the harmonies are sounding as I would hope a guitar would sound.
Okay, let me ask you about something there that I'm really curious about. You mentioned that you're a self-taught musician, so I think more people should be self-taught, and I think there are too many people studying composition and studying music academically who don't need to do that. It's actually not necessarily always helpful to take that approach. I wonder if you could talk about this aspect of your musical upbringing. Like, first of all, do you ever have any regrets about having chosen to remain self-taught? Do you think there are things that you might have learned more quickly or more easily had you studied in a more formal setting?
Oh yes, that's a sensitive touch. One thing is, when I was young, music teaching in Portugal was not so, like the possibilities were not so wide as they are now. There was a music conservatory, and there was a jazz school, but basically that was it. And either of them very conservative. And from the very early start, it was clear for me that that I would prefer to be free from having to justify the investment in learning something, because I got the feeling very early on that when a musician invests a lot of energy and time into acquiring a skill, it's very hard for him or her to afford not to embody those, like not to justify the investment. So if I want to study guitar and I go to a guitar school and I take guitar lessons for many years and I learn to play really fast, it doesn't make sense for me to play slow because all my energy was invested in learning how to play fast. So it's just an example. People who invest a lot of energy in learning something will want to materialize that, and I hear that in young musicians that get out of jazz school. They sound like, very skillful. Everything is right, the sound is right, the technique is excellent, and I'm generalizing, but very often it just sounds like what can be taught in a jazz school, which is standard forms and standard ways of thinking.
Well, I want to jump in here for a second. I completely agree with that, because I was asked to participate in a jazz jury a few years ago at a music conservatory that had a jazz department. And so I went in and I told them I'm not a jazz musician. So, you have to understand that, I love jazz and there are artists that I'm very interested in, but I'm not primarily, I'm not a jazz musician. So I went in and heard these different recitals by groups and soloists who had put this sort of master's recital together. And what I heard was a lot of very lifeless academic jazz that was necessarily, because of the nature of the training, focused on techniques from the past that had been turned into theoretical objects of contemplation and then learned by the students. And it was completely uninteresting. And I thought, how am I supposed to evaluate this? Because if we're evaluating the technical skill, then yes, it's very technically clean and they're very good at it. But artistically, there was nothing happening. So...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so now, of course, I could use a whole lifetime of learning and practice of what I could have learned in school if I did that. I would love to have access to teachings about harmony, and I'd love to have much greater guitar skills than the ones I have now, because I'm starting all the way from scratch. But that would probably prevent me from thinking freely about sound and music and just make my own mind about what makes sense to do at a certain moment in life and in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it takes a very a background that is, I wouldn't say detached, but free from the obligation to fulfill anything, to justify anything, to show some allegiance to a particular way of thinking about music.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, I should also say that quite a few musicians that do go to school and acquire all the practice and knowledge and basic, the skills that are taught, do transcend that and still have an open mind and develop their own approaches to making music.
Well, I see. I think
when that happens, some brilliant things happen.
I think that when somebody is extremely open-minded by in terms of their character and their temperament, then the education doesn't change that. That's a basic part of your personality. And what I think happens in some of these more academic programs is it can take people who perhaps are not particularly creative and can provide them with the skills to mimic creativity. But if they're not, if they don't have the necessary openness to begin with, to be able to explore without knowing what the outcome is going to be ahead of time, then no amount of education is going to change that. It's a character trait. So, so the really open students will tend to resist any kind of indoctrination. They're not going to just end up being clones of their teachers. They're going to potentially have disagreements and arguments with their teachers, and they might end up disregarding much of what they've been taught. So it's probably more a character trait, and so someone like you who's clearly interested in learning lots of different things and very open-minded, you're going to find those things out one way or another.
The flip coin of that is also access to other worlds and realities in music. If you don't have access and your whole world is centered about what you're studying, you're more likely to be less open. And nowadays, people do listen to more things. People go to the conservatory and still listen to other kinds of music. And I think, I don't know about contemporary music so much, but I notice in jazz there's been the last 20 years maybe, a lot more openness in the approach to what's available as tools to make music, and that there's a cross-pollination between approaches which are more typical of free improvisation and jazz, like these notions of playing with what they call extended techniques and other approaches to articulation that are more focused in the musicality of sound itself than the more standard progressions or standard ways of thinking about melody or working with the music materials. I think there's a lot more hybrids popping up, and not only with those two, but also with rock music and noise and industrial music. There's been a lot more of cross-pollination between different genres of music, and there's more hybrids.
Well,
so I think that's a good thing, because there's it's like a spreading out of exploration of possibilities of how different models of thinking about music can inform each other and produce surprising results.
Well, let me ask about that then, because one of the things that strikes me about Spectral Evolution and other recordings you've made is that they don't obviously fit into a category, or at least not. If they do fit into a category, it must be a very small category. So, first of all, well, here's two questions that may or may not be related to each other. What do you hope the effect of these recordings will be on your listeners? What kind of experience do you want to give them? And secondly, do you have
one?
Go
Please
ahead.
ask one at a time because,
Yeah, okay.
because we talk so much.
Yeah, okay.
Well, when I produce music, an album of music, I'm constantly thinking and caring about what is the experience of listening to this going to be. Like if it's if time, if the events take too little time, it's going to be claustrophobic and stressful because it's too hasty. And if they take too long, they'll be boring and redundant. So I'm always trying to feel what's the right tension, and the tension is something that is operated in time. And one thing that always, I think I've always stayed with this notion is that I try to make music charge with abstract emotions. I try to work a lot with, as much as possible, with abstractions and make them as rich as possible, but still as abstractions. So what I try to achieve is that a listener will have a rich experience listening to the music, both in a sensorial way, that physically the music should have an effect on the body, and make the the chemicals in the body should be activated, which they are with music, with vibrations and with the response to emotional responses to certain intervals and whatever. There's a lot of physical interaction between sound and the body itself. So I want to provide an experience that is rich and intense, but on the other hand, that is not telling the listener what to think or what to feel. It's not like this is a sad part and this is a happy part and this is. I try as much as possible not to encode any particular meanings or emotions in the music. I try to make it. Try to let the music be itself and to be a listening experience. And sometimes it's an experience that is transporting, that the listener is carried somewhere else. Sometimes it's transforming, potentially. I don't know. I never know. Like the listener, ideally with art in general, I like it to think of it of either transporting or transforming, that you are exposed to something and then you're not the same person anymore. It changes you. But all of that done in a way that the listener will receive it, and it will be acquired in a personal way. So each person will decide what it means for themselves, how they feel, how they think, what it inspires, whatever, and that changes a lot. I like to try to give as much to the listener as possible, but in the end, not in a way that I'm proposing anything concrete.
Okay, so you mentioned the word listener a bunch of times, and who is your ideal listener? Do you think about that at all? Is that something that you can think about in terms of who you're making this for and what sort of person they might be? Because there are some artists who will tell you, well, my work is for everybody. It's for all of humanity, and it's for anybody who wants to pay attention. And I sometimes find that hard to believe. I don't think anybody really writes for everybody. I think there are artists who do it primarily for themselves, maybe for themselves plus a few close friends. And then there are others who maybe have more of an awareness of what their audience is like and what they're interested in. How do you think about these questions?
Well, I'm well aware that it's not everybody will like what I do. But for the reasons I just mentioned, I really don't have an image for that. I'm quite convinced that there will be a number of people that could be potentially interested in what I'm offering them, and that's it. I'll be grateful. I'm always grateful to learn when somebody uses the music in their lives and tell me that it means something to them, or they feel this way, or they whatever benign consequences it may have on anybody. I'm always happy to learn of such effects, but I just, it's very important for me to leave it open. So it would make sense for me to idealize a certain kind of person as a listener. Like anybody could enjoy it, and a lot of people won't.
A lot of people won't, but I think spectral evolution is accessible for a lot of people in the sense that it's experimental, clearly for the reasons that we outlined, but it also has an immediate sensuousness to it and beauty to it that I think is right there on the surface, which is not always true for experimental music. And we should point out also that beauty as a quality is not always the most important thing. It's not always the thing that the composer or the artist is aiming for necessarily. There are lots of other things that you might want from a work of art. You might want it to be stimulating, interesting, unexpected, surprising, confrontational. There might be all kinds of things. But on occasion, you get a work that is both experimental and that is just immediately striking in its surface qualities. And I think that's the case with Spectral Evolution. Some of your other body of work has that quality too. I'm thinking of Violence of Discovery and Calm of Acceptance, which is also a very beautiful recording. The last track in particular, where you used a recording of is it the Voyager spacecraft?
It's the space shuttle webcast. And it was just a silent period, but it's full of static noise.
Yeah. I found that quite gripping. I really enjoyed that album. The Space Project albums, the solo ones, are more challenging, I would say. They're more on the difficult side. And I would assume, although I don't know, that sort of work would get a smaller reception than some of the other things you've done. But,
indeed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
although those are the instruments that are on Spectral Evolution.
Is that right?
And yes, yeah, all the instruments that I used in all of the space program records are all in Spectral Evolution, and all the, so those recordings are where I developed their abilities in terms of articulation and performance with the highest level of demand, like to take it to the furthest consequences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so that's one thing. Maybe we could close with this because I really want to know about this. I understand that you designed those instruments yourself. They're handmade instruments, and that's something that for me is totally intriguing because, as you may or may not know, and as some of my listeners might already know, my uncle founded a group called the Nihilist Spasm Band in Canada in the 1960s.
Oh.
And
Oh, wow.
he was their drummer. And one of the things about the Nihilist Spasm Band that is really cool, I think, it's a noise music band out of London, Ontario in Canada, is that they built many of their instruments themselves. So they had these strange, like a strange bass guitar with 3.5 strings and giant kazoos and all of these things that looked like nothing else and they sounded like nothing else. And that was a big component of the thing that made that group so interesting. And so when I hear about people designing their own purpose-built instruments, I always get intrigued about that. So could you just tell us a little bit about what the nature of these instruments is, and how you went about building them and what they can do?
It's not like I designed all of them. Some are found objects, like some are discoveries, some are developments, and some are actual designs. Like I have a portable oscillator, which is a very simple circuit, which is activated by 2 pairs of copper wires. So it's just what there is. I just touch the wires, and if you touch them, if you press on them, the pitch goes up, and if your fingers have moisture, it goes further up, because moisture conducts electricity. And that sounds a bit like, I don't know, well, never mind. It sounds weird. I have another instrument which is made with one of those miniature guitar amplifiers, like a Marshall amplifier, which is like a battery-operated 1-watt amplifier. And I do feedback with a microphone, and that's like the second sound on Spectral Evolution is a feedback with a microphone and the portable amplifier. And I plug that into a filter which is controlled by lights, and like there's a LED on the microphone, and I block the light to modulate the filter, and it drives the feedback pitch, and the amp has some switches that I can activate as keys to make it sound or not sound, to articulate sound emission. There's another one which I built, but out of parts that I didn't make, which is a modular synthesizer circuit, which is only feedback, internal feedback through a delay. And it's operated with the theremin antenna that controls the amplifier, and the joystick to modulate the frequencies. So that's the sound that sounds like a bird in a way. It's more, for me, it sounds more like a flute, but sometimes it resembles bird sound. And it's like the first trio in the intro on Spectral Evolution. It's those 3 instruments, a guitar and those 2 kinds of feedback. I also have like a modular synthesizer with a ribbon controller, like at the Trautonium. There's a module for that. Mm-hmm. And some other feedback devices. I even designed the Glove controllers to play sine waves in the beginning. But all the wires broke, and I stopped using them. Yeah, there's another amplifier that I took out, one of those miniature amplifiers that I took out the top part to expose the circuit and just play with my hands on the circuit board, and it makes all kind of really strange sounds. And yeah, a few others, but that's I didn't design the amplifier, just found out it could make these sounds when it touched on the circuit board, and I learned how to control them to some extent. So some of the instruments are adaptations of objects that existed already, and some others I designed from the beginning, like the oscillator. And some others I refined over time, like the feedback circuits and the feedback amplifier and so on.
Okay, well, it's always challenging, I think, for listeners who maybe haven't heard the record yet to imagine what it is we're talking about. But if you haven't heard the album yet, this is it, Spectral Evolution. And I can only give it my highest recommendation. I've been listening to it practically on repeat since it came out. I think it's a beautiful piece of work. So
it's not experimental. It's more classical music than experimental.
Right. Well, whatever it is, it's a wonderful recording, and certainly I encourage all my listeners to engage with it. So, Rafael, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today and talk about your work.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure.
Great pleasure.